The champagne glistened like liquid gold at Boston's finest restaurant, but as Emma Sinclair raised her glass to toast an $8 million victory, her mother's whispered words sliced through the celebration. James will take over now. 8 years of blood, sweat, and a second mortgage gone in a heartbeat to a brother who'd rather sell their family's soul than save it. What secret vow turned her triumph into betrayal, and who will pay the price when the truth spills out? Hit subscribe and help us reach 1,000 supporters. Join Emma's fight for justice. The champagne glistened like liquid gold at Boston's finest restaurant, but as Emma Sinclair raised her glass to toast an $8 million victory, her mother's whispered words sliced through the celebration. James will take over now. 8 years of blood, sweat, and a second mortgage, gone in a heartbeat to a brother who'd rather sell their family's soul than save it. What secret vow turned her triumph into betrayal, and who will pay the price when the truth spills out? Hit subscribe and help us reach 1,000 supporters. Join Emma's fight for justice. The private dining room at Ellsworth buzzed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of excited voices. It was March 10, 2025, and Emma Sinclair, at 37, stood at the peak of a mountain she'd spent nearly a decade climbing. Around her, the polished oak table gleamed under soft chandelier light, reflecting the faces of investors from Meridian Capital. Sharp suits, sharper smiles. Michael Carter, the lead investor, stood tall, his graying hair catching the glow as he raised his glass. "To Hearth and Harvest," he said, his voice rich with confidence, and to Emma Sinclair, the visionary who turned a corner shop into a national name. The room erupted in applause, and Emma's chest swelled with a pride she hadn't felt since the day her first subscription box shipped out. She glanced at her parents across the table. Susan Sinclair, her mother, wore a navy dress that hugged her slight frame, her hands clasped around a glass she barely touched. Beside her, Robert Sinclair, her father, adjusted his tie with a nervous grin, his eyes darting between Emma and the investors. They looked happy, proud even, but there was something off, a flicker in Susan's gaze that Emma couldn't place. She pushed it aside, letting the moment wash over her. $8 million. After months of late-night pitches, spreadsheets, and sleepless worry, she'd done it. Hearth and Harvest, once a struggling gourmet store in Cambridge, was now shipping artisanal jams and condiments to 48 states. All because of her. 8 years ago, Emma began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach, I walked away from a six-figure job at Morgan Stanley to save my parents' dream. Everyone thought I was crazy. My boss, my friends, even my brother, James. She paused, letting the words hang. He called it a sinking ship. Let it go, Emma, he said, find them something else. But I couldn't. That little shop wasn't just a business. It was my childhood. Sticky fingers in the kitchen, watching Mom perfect her raspberry jam. A few investors chuckled, nodding appreciatively. I sold my condo, took out a second mortgage, slept on a cot in the stockroom for 6 months, and now, here we are. Michael clapped again, his eyes gleaming. Remarkable, he said, from near bankruptcy to this? An online subscription model, manufacturing partnerships, national distribution. You've built something extraordinary, Emma. Laura Bennett, another investor, leaned forward, her sharp bob framing a curious expression. And the leadership structure moving forward? She asked. We're investing in your vision. How do you see it playing out? Emma opened her mouth to answer, but Susan's hand slipped into hers under the table, cool and trembling. Emma, dear, her mother whispered, leaning close enough that her lavender perfume filled the air. You've done so well with all this groundwork, but when James gets back from Wharton next month, he'll make the perfect CEO. You're the creative one. He's got the business mind for this scale. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Sharp and sudden, stealing the breath from Emma's lungs, she froze, her smile still plastered on, but inside, ice began to form, creeping through her veins. James, her golden boy brother who'd spent the last year sipping espresso in Europe, posting Instagram stories of cobblestone streets while she wrestled with supply chains and payroll. The brother who'd barely sent a text about the family business, let alone lifted a finger to help. 8 years. 18-hour days, skipped vacations, a personal life shoved into a drawer. And her mother still saw her as the temporary fix, the warm-up act for James's grand entrance. Emma squeezed Susan's hand back, hard enough to feel the bones shift, and forced her voice to stay even. "We'll talk about that later, Mom," she said, her eyes locked on the investors. Michael raised an eyebrow, catching the exchange. "Everything okay over there?" he asked, his tone light but probing. "Absolutely perfect," Emma replied, raising her glass higher, though her hand trembled slightly. "To the future." The room echoed her toast, but behind her smile, gears were already turning. She'd built this company from ashes, herself, not James. And now, what? Handed over because he had an MBA and a Y chromosome? As the dinner wore on, Emma's mind raced back to the beginning. 8 years ago, her father's call had changed everything. "We're failing, Em," Robert had said, his voice cracking over the phone. "The second location tanked, the recession hit hard, we're 3 months from closing." She'd been a rising star at Morgan Stanley then, crunching numbers in a sleek office overlooking Manhattan. Her colleagues had laughed when she resigned. "You're leaving finance for Fancy Jam?" her boss had asked, incredulous. Even James, finishing his undergrad, had shrugged. "It's a lost cause, Em, let it go." But she couldn't. She'd grown up in that shop, watching her parents source berries from local farms, greeting every customer by name. It was their legacy, and it became hers. The first 2 years were hell. She worked the counter by day, pored over spreadsheets by night, sold the second location, renegotiated contracts. When cash ran dry, she'd mortgaged her condo, sleeping in the stock room when rent and mortgage payments collided. James graduated, took a consulting gig, and offered occasional advice from the sidelines. Usually useless, always detached. Her parents never minded his absence, always quick to say, "He's gaining experience for later." Meanwhile, Emma turned the tide. A viral blog post about their preserves sparked a subscription service. 20,000 monthly customers now. Last year, she'd landed partnerships with 3 gourmet chains, boosting revenue by 340%. And still, Susan's whisper echoed, "James will take over." Dinner ended with handshakes and promises of Monday meetings. Michael's grip was firm as he murmured, "We should talk soon, just you." Emma nodded, understanding the subtext. The investors hadn't missed Susan's words. In the town car home, Susan chattered about James's return, Robert nodding along, oblivious to the storm brewing in Emma's chest. She stared out at Boston's city lights, her reflection pale in the glass. 8 years, and they still didn't see her. But they would. She'd make sure of it. Back at her apartment, sleep wouldn't come. By 11 p.m., she was in her car, driving to the Hearth and Harvest office, the streets silent but for the hum of her engine. She needed answers, something, anything, to explain this betrayal. The office loomed dark and empty as she unlocked the door, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She headed straight for the storage room, pulling out dusty boxes of old records. Whatever her parents were hiding, she'd find it. And when she did, nothing would be the same. The Hearth and Harvest office was a tomb at midnight, the silence broken only by the rustle of old papers as Emma Sinclair tore through dusty boxes in the storage room. Her hands trembled, not from the chill of the unheated space, but from the sting of her mother's words still echoing in her skull. James will take over now. 8 years of her life poured into this company, and they'd planned to hand it to her brother all along. Like she was some placeholder, a stopgap until the golden sun returned. She yanked another box from the shelf, its cardboard edge splitting under her grip, spilling yellowed receipts and faded photos onto the floor. And then she saw it. A folded letter, tucked inside a ledger from 20 years ago, its edges brittle with age. Emma's breath caught as she unfolded it, the handwriting unmistakably her grandfather's, stern, slanted strokes in black ink. "Robert," it began. "Hearth and Harvest is our legacy. Promise me you'll let James take it when the time comes. The eldest son is our future." Below, her father's shaky signature. "I promise, Dad. but it was the final line in her mother's neat cursive that drove a knife into her chest. Emma will understand. She's strong. The letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the concrete like a dead leaf. She stared at it, her vision blurring with tears. This wasn't just favoritism. It was a vow, a sacred pact with a dead man, etched in ink and sealed with her sacrifice. They'd never intended for her to lead. Not then, not now, not ever. She sank to her knees, the cold seeping through her jeans, and pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. 8 years flashed before her. The nights she'd slept on a cot in this very room, the days she'd skipped meals to balance the books, the moment she'd signed away her condo to fund the first e-commerce platform, all for a dream that wasn't hers to keep. A memory surfaced, unbidden, 5 years old, standing on a stool in the kitchen, her tiny hands stirring a pot of bubbling jam while Susan smiled down at her. "You're my little helper," her mother had said, brushing flour from Emma's cheek. That love, that warmth, it had felt real. Had it all been a lie? Emma snatched the letter from the floor, crumpling it in her fist. "They think I'll understand," she hissed to the empty room, her voice raw. "They think I'll just step aside." She stood, pacing the cramped space, her shadow flickering against the shelves. James had known about this. He had to. 5 years ago, when the shop was drowning in debt, she'd begged him to help. "I'm not wasting my life on Dad's failure," he'd snapped, already packing for his consulting job in New York. He'd abandoned them, abandoned her, and yet here he was, the anointed heir. Why? Because he was born first? Because he was a son? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, shattering the spiral of her thoughts. It was 6 a.m. She'd been here all night. The screen glowed with Jennifer Hayes' name, her old business school professor, and the woman who'd connected her to Meridian Capital. Emma answered, her voice hoarse. "Jen, I need you." A pause, then Jennifer's groggy reply. "Emma, it's Saturday. What's wrong?" The dam broke. "They've planned it from the start," Emma said, her words tumbling out. "Mom, Dad, they're giving it to James. I found a letter from Grandpa. They promised him 8 years, Jen, and they think I'll just understand." Jennifer's sigh crackled through the line. "I'm coming over. Don't do anything rash until I get there." 30 minutes later, she walked through the office door, 2 coffees in hand, her silver hair pulled into a messy bun. She set the cups on a crate and studied Emma, who sat cross-legged amid the wreckage of papers, the letter clutched in her lap. "Let me see it," Jennifer said, her tone firm but kind. Emma handed it over, watching as her mentor's eyes scanned the words, narrowing with each line. "This is why they've been so cavalier about your work," Jennifer said finally, tossing the letter onto the floor. "It's not about merit. It's about tradition." "Then why didn't they tell me?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "Why let me kill myself for this if it was always his?" Jennifer sat beside her, the crates creaking under her weight. "Maybe they thought you'd fight less, if you didn't know. Or maybe they convinced themselves you'd be fine with it. Emma's strong, right?" She tapped the letter. "But you've got a choice now. You can keep Hearth and Harvest and lose your family, or let James have it and walk away. What do you want, Emma?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the dust motes swirling around them. Emma stared at the letter, then at the photo she'd pulled from the box earlier. Her and Susan, laughing in that kitchen long ago. "I want what I've earned," she said at last, her voice steadying. "I want them to see me. Not their promise, not James. Me." Jennifer nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then we've got work to do. Let's make some calls." By noon, Emma had spoken to Michael Carter, arranging an emergency meeting with the investors for Sunday morning. She'd also called Sarah Miller from marketing and Emily Johnson from product development, asking them to come in. "It's urgent," she'd said, and they'd agreed without hesitation. Loyal soldiers from the early days when they'd built this empire together. Robert called twice, leaving voicemails about James's exciting ideas, but Emma let them go unanswered. This weekend wasn't about her brother, her parents. It was about her future. As the sun climbed higher, Emma stood at her office window, the Boston skyline stretching before her. The letter lay on her desk, a relic of a past she couldn't change. But the future? That was hers to shape. She thought of Susan's whisper at dinner, the casual dismissal cloaked as praise, and her resolve hardened. They'd hidden this from her, lied to her, for years. If they wanted James so badly, they'd have to fight her for him, and she wouldn't go down easy. She turned back to the room, her eyes catching on a jar of raspberry jam on the shelf, a sample from their latest batch, her recipe perfected over sleepless nights. It wasn't just a product, it was her blood, her soul. James didn't know the first thing about it. Let him try to take it, she thought, her jaw tightening. Let them all try. She'd built this from nothing, and she'd be damned if she let a dead man's promise tear it down. Emma Sinclair stood at her office window, the midday sun casting long shadows across the Boston skyline, her resolve as solid as the steel towers outside. The crumpled letter from her grandfather lay on her desk, a silent accusation she'd answered with a plan. She'd spent the morning rallying her allies. Jennifer Hayes, Michael Carter, Sarah Miller, Emily Johnson, all pieces of a counterstrike she'd unleash tomorrow. But as she reached for her phone to check the time, it buzzed with an incoming call. The screen flashed James Sinclair, and her stomach twisted. She hadn't spoken to her brother in months. With a steadying breath, she answered. "Hey, Em." James's voice burst through, cheerful and oblivious like he was calling about a football game. "Just landed at Logan. Mom says we've got an $8 million deal. Perfect timing for my return, right? I've got big ideas. Gourmet Galaxy's offering $15 million for the jam recipe. Think of it. We'd be set for life." The words hit her like a freight train, each syllable a blow to the empire she'd built. The jam recipe, her creation, perfected over years of trial and error, the heart of Hearth and Harvest, was just a paycheck to him. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles whitening. "You want to sell it?" she asked, her voice low, dangerous. "Why not?" James laughed, the sound grating against her nerves. "It's a no-brainer. We cash out, rebrand, go global. Mom and Dad are on board. Said it's my call now." Emma's vision blurred, rage and disbelief warring in her chest. Her call, her company. And he thought he could waltz in, sell her soul, and take the crown? Before she could respond, a text from Sarah Miller pinged through. "Emergency." James zoomed the team, offering 30% raises if we back him. Ethan's wavering. The room tilted. Her brother wasn't just coming for her job. He was coming for her people. She ended the call with a curt, "We'll talk tomorrow," and immediately dialed Sarah. "Get everyone here now," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We've got a fight on our hands." Within an hour, the Hearth and Harvest conference room filled with her core team. Sarah from marketing, Emily from product development, Ethan Davis from operations, and a dozen others who'd been with her since the lean years. They sat in tense silence, the air thick with uncertainty. Emma stood at the head of the table, hands braced against its edge, and met their eyes. "James is back," she began. "He wants to sell the jam recipe, our recipe, to Gourmet Galaxy for $15 million. He's promised you raises to win you over. I need to know where you stand." Emily spoke first, her voice steady. "I'm with you, Emma. That recipe's ours. You made it. We perfected it. No amount of money changes that." Sarah nodded, crossing her arms. "Same here. James doesn't know this company. He doesn't know us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Ethan stared at the table, his broad shoulders hunched. Emma's heart sank. She'd hired him 6 years ago, a single dad scraping by. They'd delivered orders together at 3 a.m., rain soaking through their coats, laughing through the exhaustion. "Ethan?" she prompted, her voice softer. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "I've got a kid, Emma. Daycare's killing me, and James promised stability. 30% more, guaranteed." "I'm sorry, I can't say no to that." The room went still, the betrayal hanging like smoke. Sarah's jaw tightened, but Emma held up a hand. "I get it," she said, though the words tasted like ash. "Family's everything, but this company's my family, and I thought it was yours too." Ethan flinched, dropping his gaze. She turned to the others. "Anyone else?" No one moved. The remaining dozen stood firm, their loyalty a lifeline in the storm. But Ethan's defection cut deep, a crack in the foundation she'd thought unbreakable. She dismissed them with a nod, then sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Her phone buzzed again. Michael Carter this time. "Emma," he said when she picked up, "we've got a problem. James emailed the board last night, pitching the Gourmet Galaxy deal. They're intrigued. 15 million's a big number. I still back you, but you've got 24 hours to prove your vision's worth more. Sunday meeting's your shot." The deadline loomed like a guillotine, 24 hours to save everything she'd built. She thanked Michael, hung up, and grabbed her laptop. If James wanted a fight, he'd get one. She called Jennifer next, briefing her on the chaos. "He's splitting my team and selling my work," she said, her voice cracking. "I need a counterplan now." Jennifer's response was calm, calculated. "You've got that Harvest Haven deal in your pocket, right? The $20 million contract you've been negotiating on the down low?" Emma nodded, though Jennifer couldn't see. "Good," her mentor continued. "That's your ace. Prep it tonight. Show them you're the future, not him." Emma spent the next hours in a frenzy, pulling files, drafting slides, emailing Harvest Haven for final confirmation. Around 8 p.m., she found a photo in her desk drawer. Her and Susan, laughing in the old shop's kitchen, jam smeared on their aprons. She traced her mother's smile with a trembling finger, tears spilling onto the glossy surface. "You used to believe in me," she whispered. What happened? The memory twisted the knife deeper. Those days when Susan had called her my little chef, when love hadn't come with conditions. Now her mother was cheering for James to dismantle it all. She wiped her eyes, shoving the photo back into the drawer. Sentiment wouldn't win this war. Strategy would. By midnight, her presentation was ready. Harvest Haven's $20 million deal, 3 years of guaranteed growth, keeping the recipe and the brand intact. It was more than James's quick cash out. Sustainable, personal, hers. But as she saved the file, doubt crept in. What if the board didn't care? What if Ethan's defection spread? What if her parents stood by James no matter what? She paced the office, the jar of raspberry jam on her shelf catching her eye. She unscrewed the lid, the sweet tart scent flooding her senses, grounding her. This was why she'd fought, why she'd stayed. Not for her parents, not for James, but for what she'd created. Tomorrow she'd face her brother, her team, her investors, and she'd win. Or she'd burn it all down trying. She sealed the jar, her reflection fierce in the glass. "Let's see who they choose," she muttered, the words a promise to herself. The clock ticked toward Sunday, every second a drumbeat of war. Monday morning broke over Boston with a clarity that felt mocking, the sun glinting off the hearth and Harvest office windows as Emma Sinclair prepared for battle. She'd barely slept, her eyes burning from a night of refining her Harvest Haven presentation, but adrenaline kept her upright. At 7:30 a.m., she stood in her glass-walled office, smoothing her blazer, when Sarah Miller and Emily Johnson arrived early, their faces set with quiet determination. "We're with you," Sarah said, squeezing Emma's shoulder. A dozen other employees trickled in behind them, a silent army of loyalty. Emma nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, then retreated to her desk, clutching the photo of her and Susan. This was it, the reckoning. At 8:30, Susan and Robert Sinclair stepped off the elevator, Susan in a crisp blazer like she was dressing for a coronation, Robert trailing with tired eyes. At 8:42, James swaggered in, his tailored suit screaming confidence, shaking hands with employees he barely knew. "Great to be back," he boomed, clapping Emma's gaze from across the room. She watched from her office, her heart a drumbeat of fury and grief, as James played the conquering hero her parents had always wanted. Susan beamed, pointing out the new displays to him, oblivious to the storm about to break. Precisely at 9, the elevator dinged and Michael Carter emerged with Laura Bennett and 2 Meridian Capital lawyers, their briefcases snapping shut with finality. The office hushed, employees sensing the weight of the moment. Susan hurried over, extending a hand. "Michael, so good to see you. I'd love to introduce my son, James. He's..." Michael cut her off, his tone polite but firm. Actually, Susan, we're here for Emma. But it'd be best if you all joined us in the conference room. Susan blinked, her smile faltering, as James smirked and followed, Ethan at his side. The conference room crackled with tension as they took their seats. Emma at the head, Susan, Robert, and James on one side, Michael and his team on the other. Michael opened his briefcase, laying out documents with a deliberate calm. Meridian's investment was based on Emma's leadership, he began, his voice cutting through the silence. Her track record turned Hearth and Harvest into what it is. Since Friday, we've had to reassess. There's a discrepancy in expectation. Robert cleared his throat. We've always seen this as a family business, with James bringing fresh strengths now that he's back. James leaned forward, exuding charm. Exactly. I've secured a deal with Gourmet Galaxy. $15 million for the jam recipe. It's a game changer. I'll take us global, Susan nodded proudly. James has the vision we need. Emma's pulse roared in her ears, but she kept her face neutral, waiting. Michael turned to her. Emma, your response? She stood, clicking her laptop awake, and projected the Harvest Haven email onto the screen. This is a $20 million contract over 3 years, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It keeps our recipe, our brand, our soul intact, growth without selling out. She faced James, her eyes blazing. Where were you when I slept in the stockroom to make payroll, when I sold my condo to keep us afloat? You don't get to waltz in and cash out what I built. The room stilled, James's smirk fading. Before he could retort, the door swung open and Sarah led 12 employees inside. We stand with Emma, Sarah declared. She's the heart of this company. But Ethan stepped forward from James's side, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Emma, my kid needs me, I'm with James. Michael frowned, glancing at Laura. This complicates things, he said. Emma took a breath, pulling the crumpled letter from her pocket. This is why they chose James, she said, sliding it across the table. A promise my grandfather forced on Dad. The eldest son is our future. Mom wrote, Emma will understand. But I don't. She turned to Susan, tears brimming. I gave everything 8 years, my home, my life, and you think I'll just hand it over? Susan's face crumpled, a sob escaping her. Emma, I didn't mean to lose you, she choked out, reaching across the table. Emma pulled back, her own tears falling. You lost me when you chose him over me. Robert looked away, his hands trembling, while James scoffed. You're being dramatic, Em. This is business. Emma ignored him, facing Michael. You invested in me, not a dead man's promise. I've got the deal, the team, the vision. Michael exchanged a glance with Laura, then dropped the bomb. James moved faster than we thought. This morning, he sold 10% of Hearth and Harvest shares to Gourmet Galaxy, without board approval. Emma, you don't have full control anymore. The room gasped, Susan clutching Robert's arm, James paling. Emma swayed, the betrayal a physical blow. He did what? She whispered, then straightened, her voice steel. Then, I'm done. I'll take Harvest Haven's $20 million and start over. Hearth and Harvest dies without me. James lunged forward. You'd abandon your own family? He shouted. I'm protecting what I built, Emma shot back. You weren't here for the blood and tears. You don't get the glory. Michael raised a hand. Emma, we back you. But you've got 2 paths. Stay and fight for control, or leave and build anew. Your call. She looked at Susan, sobbing silently, at Robert's bowed head, at James's flushed anger. The photo of her and her mother flashed in her mind. John-stained hands, a love long gone. I'm leaving, she said, her voice breaking but firm. Hearth and Harvest was mine. Now it's nothing without me. She grabbed her laptop, nodding to Sarah and the team. Let's go! Susan cried out, Emma, please, come back! But Emma kept walking, tears streaming down her face. The elevator doors closed on her parents' stunned faces, James's curses echoing behind. She'd lost her family, her company, but not her soul. As the door shut, she whispered, I'm free. And the weight of 8 years began to lift, even as her heart shattered. The elevator doors slid shut, muffling Susan Sinclair's desperate cries and James's fading curses, leaving Emma Sinclair alone with the hum of dissent. Her tears fell freely now, streaking her cheeks as she clutched her laptop, the weight of her decision pressing down like a stone. She'd walked away from hearth and harvest, her blood, her soul, her prison, leaving behind 8 years and a family that no longer knew her. The photo of her and Susan burned in her mind, a relic of a love she'd buried in that conference room. But as the elevator hit the ground floor, a strange calm settled over her. She wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the crisp Boston morning, Sarah Miller and Emily Johnson at her side. "We've got you," Sarah said, her voice a lifeline. Emma nodded, whispering, "Let's build something new." 6 months later, the scent of raspberries filled the air at a sleek new facility on the outskirts of Boston. Hearth and Harvest, the original, was a memory, its name tarnished by James's gambit. But here, in this sunlit space, Emma stood at the helm of something reborn. Hearth and Haven, a company forged from the ashes of betrayal. The $20 million Harvest Haven deal had been her launchpad, and with Michael Carter's backing, she'd built a team, Sarah, Emily, and 10 others who'd followed her out of that elevator. The first product line, a reimagined raspberry jam, had hit shelves 3 weeks ago and sales were soaring, 40% above projections. She watched her employees bustle around the packing line, their laughter a balm to her battered heart, and felt a flicker of pride she hadn't known in years. Back at the old Hearth and Harvest, James clung to a sinking ship. The Gourmet Galaxy deal had imploded when Emma pulled the recipe, her recipe, out from under him. The 10% share sale had spooked investors, and without her team, production faltered. Word reached Emma through industry whispers. James had fired Ethan Davis last week, his promises of stability crumbling as the company bled cash. She felt a pang for Ethan. His daughter's wide eyes haunted her, but he'd made his choice. James's reign was crumbling, and Susan and Robert, now silent partners, watched their legacy unravel. Emma didn't gloat. She didn't have the energy. She'd won, but the victory tasted bittersweet. That evening, she sat alone in her modest apartment, a far cry from the condo she'd sold years ago. The city lights twinkled beyond her window, a quiet companion to her thoughts. Her phone buzzed. A text from Susan. "Emma, I'm so sorry. You were the best thing I ever had." Emma stared at the words, her chest tightening. She saw her mother's face in that conference room, crumpled with regret, heard her plea, "Come back," and felt the ache of a wound that hadn't healed. She set the phone down, tears welling again, and pulled a photo from her desk drawer. Her 5-year-old self grinned beside Susan, jam-smeared and carefree. "I miss you," she whispered, tracing her mother's smile. "But I can't go back." She didn't reply. Not yet. Forgiveness lingered on the horizon, a fragile hope she wasn't ready to grasp. Instead, she stood, crossing to a shelf where a jar of Hearth and Haven's jam sat, its label bold and new. She unscrewed the lid, inhaling the familiar scent, and let it carry her back, not to pain, but to purpose. This was her legacy now, built with her hands, her team, her heart. Jennifer Hayes' words echoed from months ago. Families who stayed, Sarah, Emily, the others, they'd stayed. They'd chosen her when her blood hadn't. The next day, she walked the Hearth and Haven floor, clipboard in hand, checking shipments. Sarah approached, a grin splitting her face. "We just hit 50,000 subscribers," she said. "Your jam's a hit." Emma laughed, the sound light and free. "Our jam?" she corrected, and Sarah hugged her, fierce and quick. Later, Michael Carter called. "You're proving us right," he said. "Meridian's doubling down. Another $5 million if you want it." Emma smiled into the phone. "Let's talk Monday." She didn't need the money, not yet, but the trust felt like a gift. That night, she hosted a small team dinner at the facility, folding tables laden with takeout and jars of their jam spread on bread. Laughter filled the air, and for the first time in months, Emma felt whole. She raised a glass, water, not champagne this time, and toasted. "To us," she said. "To what we've built." The team cheered, and she caught Emily's eye, a shared nod of understanding. This was her family now, forged in loyalty, not blood. As the evening wound down, Emma stepped outside, the cool air brushing her skin. She looked up at the stars, faint against the city glow, and thought of Susan's text. Maybe one day she'd call. Maybe one day they'd sit across a table, not as enemies, but as something else. Strangers learning to heal. For now, she had this: a company thriving, a team unbroken, a life reclaimed. She pulled the photo from her pocket. She'd started carrying it, a reminder of where she'd begun, and tucked it back with care. "You'll see me, Mom," she murmured. "I'm still here." Back inside, the team called her for dessert, and she joined them, the warmth of their voices wrapping around her like a blanket. Hearth and Haven wasn't just a business. It was her redemption, her proof that worth didn't need a family stamp. She'd lost so much: parents, a brother, a name. But she'd gained more: a future she'd shaped, a legacy no one could steal. As she bit into a slice of jam-slathered bread, the taste sweet and sharp, she felt it. Hope. Fragile but fierce, blooming where pain had once ruled. The stars above Boston winked, and Emma Sinclair smiled, ready for whatever came next.